Hey guys, this is Shinoo at InnoKinetic, here to settle a hotly debated issue. Which is the better sports car, a Lotus Elise or a Lotus Exige? So thanks for tuning in. I think we're going to have some fun with this video. Both of these cars are absolutely amazing cars. You know, my first Elise showed up, a Series 2 car, in November of 2004. I had been on the wait list for a couple of years, pining away, biding my time, waiting for my Lotus, to arrive. In the US, we didn't get a street homologated car until that time. The Series 1 cars were never really made available as street cars in the States. We got them as track day cars, but not as a street car. So this video is really going to be talking about the cars that we actually received here in the States as street registered cars. So that really encompasses Lotus Elises and Exiges that were brought to us from 2004 to 2011. Okay, so the first cars that arrived to us, again, were the Series 2 cars with the Toyota motor. We didn't get any of the Rover motor cars or the V6 Exiges for street use in the States. So I'm going to kind of focus on just the 2ZZ powered Elises and Exiges that we received in the States, right? So as I mentioned, both of these cars are just fantastic, wonderful cars. If you love driving, you can't go wrong with either one, right? When you look at the fundamentals of these cars, they're so lightweight. Lotus had this very innovative extruded aluminum chassis that's used in both cars, right? Like under the skin, their cars are very, very much the same. That extruded aluminum tub that's been bonded together with glue and rivets weighs 150 pounds. I mean, that's just mind-blowing for anyone who's into sports cars. So it's stiff and it's light, exactly what you want in a sports car. Both the Elise and the Exige share that chassis, right? So both are lightweight. Both are super fun to drive. Both are relatively low cost, in the context of really fun to drive, more exotic, low volume sports cars. I would argue that a $50,000 to $70,000 car is considered lower cost or somewhat affordable, right? Both cars are relatively easy to work on. They're not overly complicated. Yeah, things are a little bit tight, but overall a fairly simple car, both of them, right? And then, of course, they both enjoy the Lotus history and heritage, right? Lotus is a 75-plus-year-old brand, 7 F1 championships, long line of really amazing sports cars. So both the Elise and the Exige benefit from that long history, right? Of, coming from a brand that makes really fun to drive sports cars, right? So in this video, really, I'm going to talk about some of the strengths of each of the cars. I'm going to talk about the weaknesses of the cars. And then, again, because I grew up in a generation where we didn't get participation trophies, I'm going to pick a winner, okay? And so let's jump straight into this thing. When we look at the strengths of these cars, when you have a lightweight car like an Elise or an Exige, 100-pound difference, which is what is the weight difference between an Elise and an Exige, is significant. So the Elise gets the nod in that direction, right? 100 pounds lighter than an Exige, excuse me. And so I think that's a huge advantage for an Elise. The Elise also has rear visibility, right? It's the hatch on the Exige. You just cannot see through the back of that. Whereas the Elise, as a target top, there's an actual glass in the rear that you can kind of, see through. The Elise comes with a soft top, which is pretty cool because now you've got a top that you can stow and put in the trunk or boot of the car so that if you want to drive the car with the top off and then throw it back on in case you've got rain or some other issues, the Elise, I think, has that as a fundamental advantage. So again, we're going to talk about cars here that are unmodified, straight from the factory, because we can modify both of these cars to take care of some of their weaknesses, right? The other thing with the Elise is that you can have one at a lower price, right? And that really stems from the fact that it was introduced at lower prices, but they also sold a lot more of the Elise, right? And so they sold, I think, roughly 6,000 in North America of the Elise. And I guess that kind of maybe is one of the strengths of the Exige, that it's more rare. There's less than 1,000 Exiges sold in North America. So that's maybe can be viewed as a strength. In the context of sports cars, the Elise and Exige are still really, really rare cars, right? Compared to a Corvette or a Mustang or a Miata or, frankly, a 911. There's far fewer Elises or Exiges in the U.S. But in the comparison between an Elise and an Exige, the Exige is clearly more rare. Okay, so another real key, I think, advantage of the Exige is the styling. Man, I love the way it looks. It looks so aggressive. I think it really looks the part versus the Elise. I love the Elise, but I gotta give the nod to the Exige when it comes to styling. I think the car looks fantastic. What else? Well, it came with some aero, right? It's got a front splitter, it's got a rear wing, and you can feel that difference between a stock Elise and an Exige. When you're on a racetrack, you can absolutely feel that. On a very fast sweeper, you can notice that difference. And you can argue that the rear wing on the Exige maybe was not terribly effective, and maybe a lot of the aero comes from really the fastback. Whatever the case may be, I would say the aero advantage of an Exige is undeniable, right? The other thing, the Exige came in the first year, it naturally aspirated in 2006, but from 2007 through 2011, they came supercharged from the factory, so they came with a bit more power, right? Another thing that you may not realize about the Exige is the front and rear clams are actually hand laid up fiberglass, so they're actually a lot stronger and easier to repair, which, it's an important consideration when you're looking at these cars. So it's funny because maybe that's the segue into some of the weaknesses of these cars. Because the Exige clams are hand laid up, they're also heavier, which is, I would say, one of the weaknesses of the Exige, right? Those clams are heavier than the Elise, clams, which is one of the weaknesses of the Elise, in my opinion, is the clams are a bit more fragile. They're thinner, they're lighter, they're actually better toleranced, but they're a bit more fragile, right? What else? Let's see. The Elise, another negative is that it's far more common, right? Like we talked about the volume differences between the two, right? Another funny thing about the car, well, it has the stock wheels are much heavier too, right? Unless you got the Sport Package Elise, which is what I had ordered. I got the LSS wheels, which are a forged aluminum wheel that came standard on an Exige. But if you have the standard car with the stock wheels, are pretty heavy, and so I'd say that's a negative there. And then probably the other thing about the Elise is that the market perceives it as being the lower performance car versus an Exige. And that's actually interesting because in the US, they offered the Elise from the first year onwards with a Sport Package, which effectively gave us the light forged wheels and essentially the suspension of an Exige. So in the States, they had a bit of a marketing issue versus I think in England and in Europe, they market and segment the cars very clearly differently. And so anyhow, in the States, the Elise still has a perception of having a bit less performance, right? So what are some of the other weaknesses of an Exige? Well, because there's a lot less of them and they start at higher price points, they are more expensive. So to get into an Exige, it's just more money, right? We talked about it's heavier, so I think that's a clear negative on that car. You can feel the weight overhead, as you're driving the car, whether it's the roof or the hatch, you can feel the center of gravity almost as the car is responding. We talked about the rearward vision, which is worse on an Exige, of course. That's a given. Even though the car came from the factory with the supercharger, the placement of the intercooler above the engine, and we know heat rises, then this intercooler just heat soaks. So even though you think you've got more power, a lot of that power is lost due to heat soak over time, right? So a few other things that I think on the Exige are of less value. In 2008, they went to a bigger front brake without making any changes to the rear. So some of you guys know brake bias, when you have a mid-engine car, you really kind of need to have a bit more brake to the rear. And if you go and put bigger brakes at the front, you ought to do something in the back. Well, multiple reasons why. I think when I talked to one of the ride and handling engineers at Lotus, he kind of sheepishly admitted to me that they had marketing really pushed for bigger brakes, but they didn't have enough budget to add more to the rear of the car. So I personally think that's a bit of a negative because now you've got additional unsprung weight without a significant advantage from a brake perspective. So what else? Another probably minor disadvantage is that they're a bit harder to find because there's so few Exiges. Finding a clean, unmolested car with no weird stories is a bit more difficult proposition, right? So there you go. Those are, in my opinion, some of the strengths and weaknesses of each of the cars. I've driven these cars all over, massive road trips, the track, I love both of these cars, right? But when it really boils down to the best bang for the buck, if that's the real criteria, most of us don't have an unlimited budget, right? So with that in mind, really my key choice here and car that I would take is going to be a Lotus Elise, right? And it just has more fun for the dollar. It's a lighter car, right? You get the rear visibility. It's easier to find a clean, unmolested car because there's just so many more of them, right? So there you go. That's the one I would pick. Now, if money was no issue and I had plenty of patience, then I'd take an Exige. Because the truth of the matter is the performance differential on the street is not significant enough. And frankly, if you're willing to modify either car, you can ultimately make it exactly what you want. So there you go, guys. My choice is the Elise. But of course, if I didn't have a budget consideration, the Exige would be my choice. But there you have it. We have picked a winner. And whether you agree or disagree, that's okay. We can still be friends. I love both these cars, and I love the fact that you might have watched this video and listened to it and considered my take on the whole thing. We live in a great time, guys. There are so many amazing sports cars, but between the Elise and the Exige, wow, really, really great. Great to be having these kind of first world problems in my mind. So anyhow, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.